So, welcome to the first Bearfoot Miniatures painting video, of which I was inspired to do basically because I really enjoyed building this Ogryn for my Orlock gang, and I had my camera about, so I decided to film the painting so you guys could reference it as well as I could go back and reference it in the future. So I actually got to a point where I hated painting again, and using some of these techniques I found I could both enjoy painting again because it's more of a process driven process where I can relax into the steps rather than worrying so much about individual lines or making mistakes. And you'll see that through this video where I make a mistake and just following the process can correct it without having to go back and keep repeating steps on the model. If you want a list of paints beforehand, it's both on the screen now as well as will be in the description below. So yeah, tell me what you think of the video. Tell me what I can improve. This is my first painting video, so any ways that you guys or girls would like to see this video style changed, just let me know. I'm not going to be precious about it. Tell me what I'm doing wrong video wise, and also any painting tips, throw them in. What do you think could improve this style that we've gone through in the video in a process driven way, if you can? I'm interested in hearing all sorts of input. Also, click like, subscribe to the channel if you do like the video. It helps me to know that you guys want more of this sort of content. I'm hopefully going to be doing both Necromunda painting videos as well as 30k to start, maybe some fantasy. I've got a solar and a mech army both ready to get painted. So without further ado, we'll get into the Ogryn / Orlock painting video. So the first step on the road of very little worries through the painting progress is the neutral grey from Tamiya, and I'm just going to get this on the raised edges of the model, thinking I always go top right for my light source, so that's in the back of my mind, but I'm not worrying about it too much, especially on this organic model rather than say like armor sources, which I worry about it a little bit more. But very relaxed, just going through it, get the paint on, it'll stick to the next layers will stick to the model better. And as you'll see on this particular model, it's not going to make much difference because I get some of the later steps and spoil this zenithal, but it's just good to get on there to get a feel for the model. I recommend anyone to do it as the first step of the model, just very quickly, and sometimes it's really necessary, other times it's not, so I just do it every time. It doesn't take too long and it will just give you a nice starting point for the model, as it does with me here. So the next step is to go on to Indian Shadow by Scale Colour, and I actually get the thickness of the paint wrong here, but decide to plough on because I'm both pig-headed and slightly lazy, and at this step it doesn't really make that much difference. It's more of a base colour. As I said, the under shading isn't too important to this particular model, or I decided it wasn't, or maybe made sure it wasn't going to be by increasing some other steps later on, and it's just to tie in with the sort of relaxed painting style that I like now, rather than worrying about every single step. The process will eventually sort out all mistakes is the mindset that I sort of get into. And I've chosen Indian Shadow because it gives a nice colour underneath what will be a very pale flesh tone, because I don't think there's too much UV light in the underhive. I don't think they're worrying about that when they're putting their lumens up, so it's just quite a nice base colour to start from to give this pinkish tone underneath a very pale flesh colour. So I'm just going to whack this on the model. I'm trying to keep it a bit thin myself just because I've mixed it too strong, but a nice solid base colour, not worrying about the undershading. As I said before, the undershading's there just to make the paint grip the model really nicely, because I got into the habit of using some really bad undercoats when I was incredibly poor. So we'll take it into the next step. So this next step is just meant to be rectifying, well, it's not just meant to be rectifying, it was the next colour anyway, but it will be rectifying the mistake that I made in the last step of having too thick paint. So I've started out with quite a thin pale skin from scale 75, and it's quite a nice range for the skins. It goes well with that previous scale paint, and this I'm just going to be applying to the higher edges, but the main body of the model, like I'd say 2/3, 3/4 of each area, but focusing from that top right, so the real pale edge is the top right and the deeper colour is in the recesses and sort of the bottom 2/3, and that is about as much as I think about it. I take my time with it. A great axiom that I try to follow in this is slow is smooth and smooth is fast, and I find it works out quite well. Just sort of take your time, relax into it, and I have to unfuck my mistake, but you might not have to, so just play around with it. So here's another little mistake I made and decided to put in the video. I actually then started applying a purple ink, I believe it was Druchii Violet from Games Workshop, and I was doing this through an airbrush. I wanted to give a bit more red tone into the skin from the bottom, and I sprayed it on and immediately decided I didn't like the way it looked. So basically just took it off with a brush, diluted the paint as fast as I could, and put it on, put the water on to take the Druchii Violet off, and it worked to a not noticeable, or because I was going for not noticeable degree. Like, I don't think I ruined the model with it, and just carried on painting. And it's one of them things I want to put in when I make mistakes, so that you guys can see that, well, I know you can tell that not everything's perfect from the look of the model on the thumbnail, but also not everything in the painting process is perfect, and it doesn't have to be to get a good or passable, or however you want to term my painting, standard of painting. But I'm enjoying it again, can share it with you guys, and hopefully you guys can go forward and enjoy painting by just flowing with the mistakes, or the happy accidents, as Bob Ross says. So then I get into putting Reikland Flesh Shade on the model. What I actually do is apply this slightly liberally, trying to target the recessed areas of the model, like the crease of the elbow. I'm doing the armpit, the obliques, getting right up in there in that side boob, because that's his side boob. And yeah, I then go back and just sort of wash it off the raised surfaces, so that it's a bit more targeted towards those lower areas, though I've gone for a bit of a filter effect by targeting everywhere, just to give it that bit of tone that isn't completely pallid from the last step. So in this next step, I'm just going to get into the denim dungarees that my biker Ogryn is going to have. And it's a really easy step. I'm going to use dark blue grey from Pro Acryl. And I like these as a brush paint. They require minimal thinning, so I'm not worrying about the consistency too much. Just like a little bit of water to break the surface tension, and to, I suppose, so it doesn't get too overly thick. But there's not much to worry about with these paints, and I've really enjoyed using them. I'm not sponsored by them, honest, but yeah, it just makes the painting experience that bit nicer. I found them much better than other ranges that for doing brush painting. They blend quite nicely through an airbrush, and I'm just going to block in the colour of the denim dungarees, as you can see me doing in the most boring way possible, I suppose, with a brush. And with this step, I applied it quite liberally. I put it over bits that I was still unsure of what colour they were going to be, just to keep moving. So you see I paint over some of the boots, and it's just to keep the process moving, not worrying about it too much at this point. I knew I wanted the pants blue, and it's just going to be that base colour before the weathering that really gives it its texture. So I'm going to actually admit something for this step, and this step's going to be the Hazard Stripe step. And I'm using Averland Sunset from Games Workshop, because I actually really think it goes on well. I like the colour. I like how you can add a purple ink to it, the colour that comes out as well as highlight it with a bone. But what I'm going to admit is I don't like an overabundance of Hazard Stripes. And I know that's going to shock everyone because I'm an Iron Warriors player, but I like them tastefully done. In small areas in the model, I think they look brilliant on pretty much every style of Necromunda model. I love them on my Iron Warriors in small amounts. It's that nice injection of colour onto the model, so I'm going to apply it to the... I actually do it on the forehead of the Iron Warriors masks, as I've used an Iron Circle mask for this Ogryn. He's going to get a forehead which is Hazard Striped, and he's also going to get a knee pad which is Hazard Striped. So I'm just putting in a couple of layers of yellow thinned so that, and you can see I give a thumbs up there, yeah, just so that it's a nice thin layer of which to work. And I'm going to put the lighter colour, the yellow, in first of the Hazard Stripe, because it'll be so much easier to go over yellow with black than it will be to go over black with yellow. So top marks for next guessing what colour we're going to be moving on to, and that's Games Workshop's Abaddon Black. And I also really like Pro Acryl's Coal Black for this step. It's just Games Workshop's Abaddon Black is available everywhere, and I'd run out of Pro Acryl. So I'm just going to be going in and hitting all of the areas that want to be black and taking them back to black. So that's going to be the coat, the boots, anywhere the leather is on the model or wants to be on a biker model. So yeah, it's just sort of a bit of a speed through step at this point. There's not going to be too many steps with the black, it's just going to be black, and all additional highlights and variants in the tone, like with much of the model I suppose, is going to come from the weathering step, the washes, the enamel filter, and then washes that are going to come in the next stages. So as you guys can see, I've just sped through this step on the video. It's going to be one of those very easy to do steps, and we'll get next onto the Hazard Stripes and just sort of placement of them. And it's at this stage that I just go back and make sure that yellow is with a really even coat. Like, you can't really see through it, it's just a solid colour of which to work the black of the Hazard Stripes onto. And it's just going over that kneecap and the top of the head again, just because I wasn't going to wait for it to dry before doing 2 coats of yellow, so I went onto the black before. And as you guys can see in this rough and ready style, I've been using all video a drill bit to paint the magnetised head on, and it was the perfect thing to actually use, so I'm not sorry for it. So just to keep everyone on their toes, I decided next to go on to the Games Workshop Lead Belcher, which is just going to be blocked in as block colours onto the faceplates of the Ogryn, because he's wearing a mask. It's then going to go onto all the pipes, all the metal across all of the model. It's hard to give a big description when it's so non-specific, and there's a lot of metal. I also put it on the base at this step, just in the means of saving time, because that's one of the benefits of this process that I like to go through, is it's very fast, so you can very easily speed paint an army. I'm going to soon be doing a Solar Auxiliary army that I'm hoping won't take too long with its 200 models and 15 tanks. But this Ogryn, yeah, just going to block in the Lead Belcher. I really like Lead Belcher as a colour. It goes on really nicely even if it's thinned quite a lot, so you can get a nice thin coat that just blocks in the colour in one go still. And it's actually one of the reasons I was a bit hesitant to do a painting video, is that the methods that I like to use, I don't like to go too complicated into them. There's a few like sort of advanced techniques, and I'm going to put that in a massive air quotes, because all I'm really doing is applying an enamel paint or an oil paint, and as an advanced technique goes, that's not the hardest, especially when it's just broken down for you and you can just follow through the steps. So yeah, as I said, I'm just blocking in the lead Belcher colours before going, hopefully, unless I randomly decide to do a curveball, into the next black step of doing the hazard stripes. So it is, what a success! I actually followed through with my steps for one time. So next I'm going to go on to the hazard stripes that are on the model. So for this, I much prefer a brush and just lining up 2 points on the model, especially on smaller things. On tanks I definitely use bits of tape. I've tried using bits of tape on things like Space Marine shoulder pads, and it just never seemed to work for me compared to just following a few basic things. So what I do is I angle the model so that I can pull down with my brush. So my brush isn't moving at an angle to my arm. It's only ever moving downwards following the line of my arm. Then what I do is I choose, say, 2 points in the model. On this one, it was a rivet that I would use as the basis for the black line, and then I basically made my hazard stripes the width of between the rivets. This, on this iron circle head, it was in fact, was very easy to do because it had those rivets down. On Space Marine shoulder pads, especially Mark III shoulder pads for the iron armour of Heresy Marines, they've got lots of rivets on that you can go between and get a nice consistent spacing. Another way to do it, even if I do prefer painting with a brush, you can use a thin piece of tape and just put dots at either end of the tape, and then I actually prefer going in with a brush to join up those dots rather than leaving the tape on and spraying over the top. It's just what I prefer to do. Now, it doesn't matter too much if you wave as you go through the hazard stripe here, because we're actually going to save that in a later step with silver and other weathering techniques, so it's not going to be too noticeable. You can also save it if you want to put a bit more effort in. I was just getting this painted for my gang, didn't think it needed it on, say, a character, like a real exemplar like painting project, like say on a Primarch model or your army leader, something that you want to put more effort into. I'd use like a bleach bone colour, heavily thinned down to give a highlight to this yellow rather than going up through the yellows. Yeah, bone colour works really good. Yeah, simples, as I put my hand up. And I would then shade it with a purple on the yellow. The black can be highlighted with a mid-grey, and I don't massively find it adds much to the model. I do think it adds a bit, so again on those projects, like you've just got to grade up the projects. How far are you going to go with each step? How much effort is worth putting in to each step? And I definitely recommend starting at the lowest and ending when you've practiced a bit more on those character models that you want to put a load of effort into. And you can actually then judge to what level you think is necessary for the look of the model that you're going for, because loads of detail in certain areas might actually take away from what you are trying to achieve in other areas. And in this model I wanted people looking at the helm. I was going to put a green eye glow onto the model, so the hazard stripes drawing attention away from that might not have been the best. I wanted to have an arm tattoo, so having hazard stripes drawing away may not have been the best. And also the cut for the back, I wanted the Calviferum symbol on the back. So these were the key sort of points in the model that I wanted to highlight, so I didn't really need a load of detail on the hazard stripes. And I'm just going in again and blocking up a bit of silver as we go through. One thing that I actually missed here, as you can see on the model, is I painted one of the not the vents, God, the ductings that are coming out of his arms, or his ripped off arm, red, and that isn't on the video, it's just blocked in because the camera overheated. As well as that, you can see I blocked in some old copper from scale 75 onto the base. It's not a massively necessary step, I just felt like doing it today. On a lot of Necromunda models that I paint, I don't actually do that. I started out doing it and got a bit lazy. mainly because I found that with the weathering steps on the base there was already some enamel colours going on there, the silver that was already on there. The draw of that colour didn't add much to the overall project. So here I move on to the old copper of the actual model. As you can see me blocking in, I just block in bits that just give bits of interest to the metal areas. So here I'm doing the side of the knees on his bionic leg, I'm doing the rings around his spudjacker, and I'm also going to do bits on the helmet. And it's just anywhere where there just needs to be that little bit of variance in colour, just to give some more interest. And it's every time, this is all about interest weighed out with effort onto the model, or even interest being balanced against taking away from interest in the areas that I want. So again, the areas of interest was the face, was the tattoo, and the jacket. And there needs to be bits of interest at the bottom areas of the model, but these are like secondary to what you're trying to achieve with the overall paint job, so not as much effort needs to go into them. So the next stage is the transfers, and this is something that I actually did a couple of times, mainly because I wrecked the transfer by trying to pull it off the paper too fast because I'm a bit impatient. But this one I just dunked into water and applied onto the model. I just tried to get only a small amount of excess because I thought I could even top up the edges of the transfer by just painting on chain links if needed. And I put it onto the arm. I don't use microset here, though a lot of people swear by it. I would recommend it because enough people do. I actually have a bottle of microset and it allows you to reactivate the transfer to move about at a later date. I just tend to always go with water because it's always worked for me. But as I say, enough painters that I trust swear by microset that it's worth anyone having a go with. I then trim the excess from the transfer, and you can see how thick that transfer is because I've made it myself there. Games Workshop transfer is obviously a lot thinner, or other companies exist a lot thinner, but this is one on my home printer. I really recommend making your own transfers to anyone that can. I prefer in a LaserJet printer just because it's a long time in between printing transfers, and I've also got a cartridge that prints white, and that only went in my LaserJet, so I prefer my LaserJet. I'm then going to put Microsol on it just to get it to adhere into and start dissolving. I'm going to put Microsol on in this process about 3 or 4 times, and I use a separate brush for it. As you can see, I've actually taped it to the Microsol bottle, so it's not being used for any other purpose except Microsol. And that's because it's a solvent and will both destroy the brush and mean that the paint is not great for your health if you mix it into your paint, which I did once and threw away the paint. So yeah, I'm going to apply Microsol here. I end up doing it about 3 or 4 times, not only on this model but every model that I tend to do it on, just because if a little bit of solvent is good, so long as it doesn't damage the transfer, more solvent is better is what I always go with. And there's no science behind that, it tends to dissolve the transfer a bit more. So don't be scared of reapplying the Microsol. It will get it, in my experience, into those nooks and crannies of the model better, and just work a bit better. As I say, I have quite thick transfers because of making them myself. So good stuff, Max. Let's carry on. And then we get into the Calviferum sheet that's going to go over to his back. As you can see, I printed this out, like, it's got to be 15 times to go on the back of this Ogryn with various, and this is the benefit of making your own transfers. I recommend it again to anyone. I can print out loads and just choose the one which fits right. So this is going to be a white ink Calviferum symbol that I just trimmed to size very roughly, and apply to the model's back. And again, I'm just going to speed through this bit now, and I position it on his back in the same way, using water, and put loads of Microsol on, and then I leave it overnight so that it can very easily be said to be done. Like, I don't want any movement in that transfer. I want it to be completely set, solvented to death and done. So I'm going to come back in the morning when this transfer is set. So we have left this overnight and come back to it, and I'm just going to go in with some black straight over the transfer, and any parts of the transfer that needed touching up, especially these chain links, I'm just going to touch up with some black. Again, it's Abaddon black, coal black. Coal black is a slightly off black, but I like not having just jet black. I suppose Abaddon black will be slightly off black as well, but coal black is more of a blacky grey. I like it. So yeah, I'm just going to touch up the transfer and also slightly sort of blend in the edges on the back. And I'm going to do this, and I did this step before applying the varnish. That I actually think the varnish is really important to tie the transfers into the same level of glossiness as the model, so you've got a consistent surface to work over. But I'm going to be putting this black over, sorry, underneath the varnish, of which we'll get into in the next step. And again, this is just because my transfers are a bit thick, but having the option to make my own transfers, I believe, far outweighs the downsides of how they come out on the model. Just being able to have a personal project that I immediately make a transfer for, I'd really recommend to anyone. Or if you know someone with a printer, mither them to death to do you some transfers for your projects. So this next step is another process step, and I'm going to be using Vallejo Satin Varnish, as I've just shown there. I find this much closer to a gloss than it is even to what I would think of as satin. Like, I'm someone that much prefers matte colours and matte finishes to models, but it's important to get this gloss step to blend the sort of gloss of the transfer so that it goes onto a gloss model, and then we've got a consistent sort of base to work from. It also then secures the transfer onto the model so it won't get damaged or sort of like the ink rub off over time. So, and it's just a nice base layer to set. It actually comes into it further into this model that I've varnished the model, so it allows me to rub off a bit of mistake that I performed later in the paint job. And I'm just going to apply this in some thin coats over the model. You'll just see the first coat, because what is the point of just keep showing you me going around the model and it just becoming slightly shinier. So we'll get back after that. Right, so here we are onto the key step of the entire model. Other than the transfers adding interest, other than the bits of paint that we get on the job, this is the sort of like core of the video, and it's my absolute favourite paint, Engine Grime by AK. And I'm going to apply this with the airbrush. Up to my experience of using it for just over a year, don't worry about it wrecking your airbrush. I was really terrified of it wrecking my airbrush before, but I use it all the time. There's a number of other YouTubers that use it all the time. I'm going to spray this all over the model in a couple of thin coats, and it's going to completely block out all of everything that we've done previously. And that's what we're actually looking for. It's going to be the key to doing this. Do not worry, you are not going to spoil anything on the model. I've done this on, I was going to say countless models, but I could count them. It would just take longer than is worth me doing. I'll make you another video instead. And yeah, I'm just going to block out the entire model in this sort of like dirty brown colour of Engine Grime. And it's going to give a very nicely battered, weathered, grimy, I'd like to say grimdark, but it's not, in my painting style, it's not so much grimdark as it is just battered, dirty, realistic looking, realistic again in massive air quotes, realistic looking, the grimy model. And that is all down to this Engine Grime. And what we're going to do is get this nice coat over. It's done there, and I'm going to start taking it off as soon as it's dried with a cotton swab. And you could do this with something like an oil paint. I prefer the enamels, just because it has that faster drying time. It can be used through an airbrush, so I can just very quickly get an even coat. And yeah, the faster drying time just allows me to do it. If I make a mistake, if I take too much off, I can then just reapply it through the airbrush again, and just very quickly add some, take too much off, add some, take too much off. And just, this is now the least stressful bit that I do on models, and it's the bit that makes the whole paint job not stressful at all. I'm being thorough in washing out my airbrush here, just with some cleaner. It does just take it out of your airbrush, never really have to worry about it. I'm wearing gloves at this point because I don't really want to get enamels sprayed onto my hand. I've also got a respirator on, and I'm going to adjust the camera. So at this point, that is now dry in the time it takes really to wash my airbrush. So I get some white spirits, and I'm going to start taking them off with the cotton buds that you see in the corner. So I pour a bit into my little tray, and the fun starts to come. So taking a cotton swab, I just dip it into the white spirit. You can get artists' white spirits as well. This is just, I was at a builder's warehouse, so got some normal white spirit. And as I say, I'm wearing a respirator and just taking off bits of the grime whilst leaving it in the recesses. I'm trying to take it off the centre parts of surfaces rather than round the edges, so that there's this blurred effect going out to the edges. It's not always successful in doing, I'm not always successful in doing that, but it ends up in the recesses and having this filter effect across the entire model. And it's different than a wash in that a wash will just stick into the deeper recesses and not really give a change in tone to the entire model. Whereas putting this filter on through an airbrush, taking it back off, will slightly change all of the pigments underneath. I know I've put a varnish on there, but it will just stain on top of that varnish. Now, the enamels are sort of halfway in between an oil paint and an acrylic paint, in that I've actually done this and sprayed the enamel paint over the model, and then the next day come back and reactivated it with white spirit. Now, I suggest doing it all at the same time, just get it out of the way, get it done with, but it does have that benefit of being able to come back to the model. Now, here I'm moving on to the hand and being a bit more delicate, as I want to leave the brown pigment around where the metal is. It gives a really nice toning to the metal, and it will give sort of a, it will allow lighter skin colours like is on this Ogryn to show through, whilst also giving depth that like is very hard to get without being a master of blending. So I'm just going to take it off the arms and just work my way across the model as, I don't know, you guys follow along. And if you guys have any questions about using these paints, where to get them from, anything like that, just get into contact with me. I was terrified, as I said, of using an, oh my god, an enamel paint through my airbrush. I was terrified for ages of doing that. It was actually a real crippler. And when I started using it, it was actually a really relaxing thing to do. Painting with a cotton swab, or Q-tip if you're American, is actually a really nice experience. It's super relaxing. You can see the results immediately. As you can see, I'm pulling off the enamel paint off the transfer, and if you make a mistake, it's not affecting anything beneath. All you've done is take too much paint off the particular point on the model. If you've taken too much paint off the particular point on the model, you can either go back in with your airbrush and the enamel paint and just put a very thin dust in. You might not even have to go back in with a cotton swab. Or if you really mess up an area, you can get your enamel paint, completely go back over it and then start again, because nothing underneath, none of your detail that you've worked on before is affected by this enamel paint. So it's just really nice to work with. So again, this is another one of the favourites of mine, and it's going to be a 50-50 mix of Tamiya Flat Earth and Flat Flesh. And I actually learnt this when I was at a painting course with the old MKA painting courses with Matt Kane and at that point Andy Wardle and Henry Steele, and they showed me to use this as a dust spray, and I actually have taken it and ran with it, and not only used it on tanks, but I use it on pretty much everything that I paint now. I really like the dusty look onto my models. It gives a nice muted matte look to anything that has been glossed before it, especially when combined with enamels. It's really good at shading the bottom, say like a coat, especially like say trench coats on guard. I found it gives a really nice shade to the bottom of the coat whilst leaving the top the base colour. And I just sprayed that all around the base to give the dustiness, the coat, and also the legs of the model. Sometimes I put it, if I imagine the model has been lying down, I put it onto the knees, the elbows, and I just try to imagine how the models moved and got dirty, and that is what this, I'm going to call it dust, but really it's like dust, dried mud, all sort of weathering effects. And I'm just sort of laughing there because I'm pulling off the base is peeling around the edge, which will be sorted in a later step. So in this next step, we're going to be adding all the real horrible and nastiness of the underhive to the base. So I'm going to start out with Winter Streaking Grime, again from AK, and it's another enamel. I water it down a bit more with my white spirits, and I'm just going to apply that liberally to the base. And I imagine this and put it into places of where there will be water or like a bit of an algae look going on the base. So in where I imagine the gutters are that I've painted in the old copper is going to get an application of this, and just trying to get it all over into the corners. I wash it down a bit more to suck it into those corners, and really it's just to give interest to the base, variance from that just metal colours. I'm just going to go over it like that, and again this dries very fast, so it makes a very good paint to work with over oil paints, which can also be used. Definitely on terrain and stuff, I use oil paints all the time because it gives the same sort of spread of paint. It's very cheap and really like using it, but enamels for a model I think are king. Next, after a quick blow dry, I'm going to move on to AK's rust effects, and I'm going to do this by watering down the enamel paint a bit more than would be usual. I'm going to put it onto the bases, or the base, or bases if you do multiple, as well as do a slightly different technique, which is I'm going to get my airbrush and blow it from a brush so that it splatters onto the base. I like this because it gives more control in where I'm placing those splatters than say flicking a toothbrush, which tends to just go everywhere in my experience. So I'm going to flick using my airbrush from the wet brush loaded up with rust effects onto the base, and it gives this nice splatter effect. Again, I really like using these enamels because if I don't like how anything has turned out, I can just get a bit of spirits and wash it off from any area of the model, from any area of the base. It's just very forgiving. You don't really have to worry about doing something wrong, because if it's wrong, you just take it off and do it again. If you've not varnished the model, like I particularly like not varnishing a model before doing these enamels when I've got a white or cream undercoat, say like a winter wash tank, and that actually gives a real nice gradient of colour to the white colours or lighter colours underneath. I'm then going to go and thin down some parts of the base and get the rust colour to wash into the corners, because I think I went too far with some of the splatterings, but it just gives a nice like texture and interest to the base. You can see I'm even unhappy with how I've done some of it. Oh no, I'm gonna clean up the base a little bit, probably before deciding that I black ringed at the wrong point, which you guys won't have seen me do, but I'm going to do it at a later stage, because like I should have just done it after doing the actual splatter effects, because I immediately splattered paint all over them, all over the ring of the base. So I'm just going to dry it off with a hairbrush, or an airbrush, a hair dryer, and carry on with the next step. So at this point now is when I'm going to suggest everyone else black rings the base. I black ringed it again now, despite the fact that I'd just done it before, after you saw the paint peel off from the base. And it's just the non-stupid way or place to black ring the base, is when you finished everything that could possibly affect that base. So yeah, I get the black ring on and carry on with the next step, which is going to be the final addition of the interest colour to the model. So this is the final colour, and it's Games Workshop's Moot Green of the Air variety, and I actually really like the hue of this colour for just giving visual interest to the model. And I'm going to test it out. I've already pre-thinned this in my bottle, and I'm going to give it very thin so I can just work up very slight, almost how you see people glazing models with a brush. I'm going to do this glaze with the airbrush, and I'm going to do it wrong, because, and I think it's important to put in that I did this step wrong. I wasn't happy with how I did it, so I apply it to the face. It might be slightly hard to see because I'm really concentrating on getting it close, rather than having the head angled for the camera. But I put far too much of the moot green on the cheeks, and I'm not actually happy with it after I finished applying it to the model. So we'll let you be the judge, and I'm about to make this mistake. I trigger the airbrush a bit too readily, and bam! There's a load of paint come out of the airbrush. I sort of study it a little bit, bam, there we go. Just a bit premature there. And I immediately jump into the white spirit, and not being worried about the actual painting of the model. I can just go in with this spirit, and it's a real nice thing to be able to do, is take off that I was just applying, not really worried about it being on there. Obviously you've got to be a little bit fast so it's not entirely set. You can't go back the next day and do this, but I can just wash away bits of that green that I was applying, and I even then take it too far and go back in with a little bit of highlight and glaze of the moot green to give interest to the eyes. Now I think green works really well, or especially this moot green, as a cool highlight and like adder of visual interest to the model, especially for silvers, greys, blacks. It just works really well, especially for a light source. So I add that to the Ogryn, and that is the Ogryn done. And at this point I now want to make, and in the video, it's been about 2 weeks, I now want to make an Ogryn gang for my Necromunda games. So that is the end of the first painting video on the channel. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it, found it informative. Hopefully you enjoyed seeing all of my mistakes across the video, and how by just ploughing through and relaxing, and in one case just easily taking them off with a cotton bud, you can carry on, enjoy the painting process without it being too stressful, and get an actually okay, or hopefully okay looking model at the end of it. Let me know whether you do like this model, what you like about it, what you don't like about it, what can be improved below in the comments. And if you do really like the video, there is a Patreon link below where you can get yourself one of the bouncy trays you can see on the gaming videos, as well as access to the Discord server where you can get involved in all of the bickering that we all do on that server. So I'll catch you guys next time.